Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining me on this second lecture of our first week. Going to continue our discussion in terms of this aspect of how freedom and the notion of what people were willing to do in order to assert themselves or just to, to provide. An aspect of, personal, individualized freedom. So in the last lecture, we looked at Martin Luther, and we looked at, not just his determination, because truly it's important to recognize that Luther really did, with all of his being, fervently believe that an individual could truly achieve a relationship with God that did not require a intermediary, right? Didn't require a priest or the Pope or anything like that, right? God's love, God's relationship is right here. You, as an individual, just have to be in the best position, prepared to receive it, right? And so, what essentially Luther was doing was calling into question the entire leadership, right? And so, as a consequence of all of that, he is not only asserting his own individual freedom, but he's asserting the freedom of all people to be able to discover this relationship. And that, as a result, begins to significantly wear down the power and authority of the church, right? That it's not the Pope that can determine if you go to heaven. You're the person who determines it, right? So we're talking about this idea that an individual has capacity, right? That they are in charge, that it is up to them to determine whether or not they go to heaven by choosing and making sure that their behaviors put them in a position to be able to receive that relationship, right? And so, without making this a theological class, what we want to be able to consider is how does that create this notion of individualized freedom? How exactly does that create this sense of individualized capacity, right? Free will, right? Not we're not there yet, but we are going to start to move in that direction because of Luther. And so in this next lecture, what we're going to be looking at are the other developments that contribute and further erode at the Catholic Church's assertion, or what you could say is monopoly on information, right? The authority in which to determine, truth and fact, right? And so we're going to be looking at the scientific revolution. Now, for this one, we're going to be looking at a few aspects. We'll first define what exactly the scientific revolution is, some of the notable people, theories, and inventions, and then, of course, the overall impact. I do want to make it very clear, though, that when we're looking at the scientific revolution, and please feel free to click on this little link here up at the top where it's, highlighted in gold or yellow or whatever it looks like on your screen. Um, when, a couple things. The first thing is let's look at the characteristics. So this is a period we're looking at roughly from 1500s all the way up until about the 1700s. But, I think it's very important to understand that nothing develops in a vacuum, that much of this quote unquote revolution that is happening in Europe during this period is the consequence of the achievements that were happening in other parts of the world, namely in Asia, the Middle East, parts of North Africa, and on the subcontinent of what we would call India today. Okay, so and the reason why the reason why it is important to recognize this is that oftentimes when you look at the ways in which like the scientific revolution is discussed, it's often discussed as if like this was the period where Europe just flourished and boomed. Well, you always have to know this is that one thing that always happens when people meet is that ideas travel, right? There's an exchange. And one of the things that contributes to this period in the 15th century all the way up until the 17th century to the 18th century is the fact that knowledge had been acquired and had been exchanged from parts of Asia, the Middle East, India, as well as North Africa, right? These are areas in which information has been flowing. Now, whether it is the preservation of this knowledge by the Greeks or preservation by, the former Roman Empire, or if it's the preservation of this knowledge by people in the Middle East, right? We have to understand that none of this actually is just happening randomly, right? What is happening in the scientific revolution is that they are building upon the ideas that were already being achieved, whether these are mathematical, mathematical achievements, achievements in astronomy, right? Planetary, orbits, all of these aspects, right? These are ideas that are being used and read and discussed. And as a result of that, here is what we get with the scientific revolution. But to be able to create some characteristics in terms of this period, what we want to think about is that the scientific revolution is really achieved by a period where observation, error, experimentation, evidence is the basis for reasoning, right? No longer are we just, tied to this idea that, well, God has deemed it so. It's in the Bible, right? No longer are we relying just so heavily on those church dominated, faith dominated resources for the truth, right? Fact is now going to be based on evidence, right? Observation, right? We're going to be able to prove that this is the way that it is, right? As a result of this, we're going to be trying to understand more about the world itself, right? It's not just that we're theorizing about why exactly, the seasons change or why exactly animals behave this way or why we as people behave this way. We're actually going to use the tools that we have. Mathematics. We're going to develop an actual process with science, what we call the scientific method, right? And we're going to use and build from those forms of knowledge, such as algebra, and develop things such as calculus, as well as celestial mechanics, to be able to come up with these theories that can be proved over and over again, right? This is going to lead into technological revolutions, right? Such as the telescope, the microscope, the mercury barometer. Now, to be very clear, remember the telescope, yes, is it improved upon by Europeans? Was the telescope already available in North Africa under the Moors? You bet it was. Was it already there in China? Absolutely. The carving of various glasses and being able to create lenses that can either create an image that's of a far distance to make it look closer, or to make an image that is very small, make it larger, right? These are already sciences that we're already developing and already present, especially in the Middle East. And so what we want to understand is that through trade, through interaction, through the exchange of ideas, people in Europe take some of these ideas and they improve upon them, right? So this isn't new, right? It isn't like the telescope is absolutely invented in Europe, right? The telescope is what is achieved during the scientific revolution is just another evolutionary step in the product, in the tool of the telescope. Okay. We're also going to look at scientific societies, academies, universities, right? Places and centers of learning. We're going to be, that is definitely this period as a characteristic. And finally, I want you to understand that this is a period where um, thinking, thinking is expanded because it is no longer evaluated by one authority to allow one group one entity to decide whether or not somebody could. Now what we have the ability for secularization of learning, meaning that it is not church doctrine that is deciding what is taught. If people are interested in trying to access this information or to be able to learn it or to be able to consider it, it can now be done. And so this is very important because when we're looking at the 15th century, the 16th century, right? What's changing from the period of, if you want to look at Columbus all the way to like Luther, that basically that roughly that, 20 to 30 year period, we see some major shifts and changes because never forget, Christopher Columbus had to go to um, had to go and speak or basically ask for this support that it would be possible for him to be able to find a route to Asia by sailing west. Okay. The predominant notion that was sanctioned by the church was the fact that you could only reach Asia by going all the way around Africa or by crossing through by land in order to get to Asia, right? His theory is that no, this is going to be possible that we could go this way. Now, was he coming up with a new theory of if this was possible? Absolutely not. What he was doing was is he was borrowing from the knowledge that had already been attained by other theorists of the time, but these theorists at the time were not sanctioned as being credible by the church. This is a period where the credibility of certain sources is no longer determined by the church authority, but by through observation, through testing, through a methodology, right? It's no longer that the Pope is deemed that, well, your theory is incredible. People are now able to discover it on their own and to figure it out. Well, we've got these ideas that are coming from the Middle East, that are coming from Asia, that are coming from the Greeks, coming from the Romans. We have these things written down because they've been preserved in various universities in North Africa and in the Middle East, and they've been translated from Greek or Latin into Arabic and back into a European language. Look, we can investigate this for ourselves. And the church authority is beginning to dissipate in this region of being able to hold on to being that entity that decides what can people believe and what not to believe. No longer do we have to buy into that. We can just discover it for ourselves. Okay. So those are the characteristics that we're going to be looking at. Now, there are a couple people that I want you guys to, think about. And you can click on their links. There's either like a video or it'll take you to another website. Check it out, right? I'm not really, going to be, you know, um, testing you or wanting you to know that, this idea that, hey, what did Isaac Newton, propose? Or can you explain to me the significance of Galileo Galilei? What I want you to think about is that in total, what exactly these individuals who are characteristic of this period, all Western Europeans, right? All of these individuals, what exactly is the significance of their ideas in terms of pushing, right? Observational thought, scientific methodology, the ability in which to come up with certain facts, right? What exactly do these achievements under these individuals who are borrowing from other sources and taking a next logical step in the evolution of, in towards a, achievement? What exactly does that do in terms of being able to create this freedom in terms of accessing knowledge or testing theories or being able to challenge that? And so just think about that. You've got everything from, moving from a Earth-centered universe to a sun-centered universe. You have various, planetary laws of motion. You have the aspects of, physics, all of these aspects. Just take a look and consider all of those. But because what you'll do is that these will be, you can use these examples in terms of how exactly that contributes to creating that individualized freedom, right? That creates that opportunity, opens up a greater amount of space for an individual to propose an additional theory or to build off of these theories or to build off of this, advancement, right? That's where I want you to use these as examples, like when you're doing your discussions or when you're doing your critical analysis papers. And of course, you can think about the inventions, right? Some of the ones that, I definitely want you to, consider about, oftentimes, just in our own, daily experience, is that, you have calculators on your phone, you have something that'll tell you the temperature, it'll tell you the time. It's all of these aspects. Well, when you think about the significance of these inventions, think about how these inventions allow people to create, measure, monitor, and predict outcomes. Okay. Think about how these various tools are able to create an experience for us that becomes more routinized, right? When you have a routine, you know what to expect. You know how to be able to consider it. You know how to be able to experience it. You know how to evaluate it. And then you know what you're supposed to do in terms of changing it. Well, tools like this, whether it is the pendulum clock or the barometer or the telescope or, the microscope, this allows us the ability in which to mark, measure, and evaluate those theories and experiences that we're having. So it's no longer, well, I know that it's hot out because the sun is up, right? I know that this is real because, I kick it with my foot and I know that the stone is real, right? No longer do we have to just rely on simply on those aspects. We actually can create various systems of measurement that are able to allow us to not only try to measure and give us actual empirical evidence of something, right, in terms of its reality or its relationship, but then we also have the ability in which to predict possibilities and outcomes. If you have a science that is able to give you an opportunity in terms of projections, this allows you that freedom to be able to think about, well, what else could be possible, right? If I'm able to come up with calculations, right, in terms of like the speed of the rotation of the earth, the distance along traveling, how long the average person takes to move across 1 mile, right? All of these different aspects, then you can be able to project and prepare for certain other achievements, right? And so these are the things that you want to be able to think about is how exactly do the theories, how exactly do the inventions create additional freedoms for individuals to be able to think about and understand the world in which they live. Okay. Now, many of these, theories that were developed along with the inventions, some of the crucial ones that I really want you to think about that have, impacted us to this day is especially the empirical method, right? We are talking about a system, a theoretical approach to investigating certain phenomena that is no longer reliant on, faith-based ideas, right? You don't necessarily have to just have faith in it. You can have evidence through repeated patterns and paradigms through experimentation that can show you that something is actually true, right? And so what we want to be able to look at is like this notion, this idea of the empirical method. This was first developed under Francis Bacon, but he is borrowing and building off of these ideas from many of what was developed in the Middle East and preserved at various centers of learning throughout the Middle East, especially in present-day Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so what I want you to think about is that how does he take that? How does he take this idea of systematic observation, being able to track this information, to be able to come up with a various understandings of the weather patterns, the idea of the movements of the sun, various planetary orbits, right? All of these different things. The empirical method is the ways in which we establish ourselves to find out and discover if something is true. Because what it does is it creates a routinized process for us to be able to measure somebody else's theory, right? Until it becomes an actual proof, right? Because the outcome always becomes the same. If somebody's able to follow the steps and we get the same proof every single time, then we know that something is to be true. No longer do we just have to say, well, it's because I said so, or it's because God has deemed it, right? And so what we already see here is that the empirical method calls into question anybody who says God has deemed it to be so. Well, we don't just need God's authority. We can just take the authority that we proved it right here. Right. Now, this is not to say that, people are suddenly becoming less religious. What we're saying, what is happening during this period is that rather than solely relying on religious doctrine, what is now happening is that there is actual processes and theories that can provide us answers to some of those other fundamental questions. One of the second ones is the atomical revolution. Prior to the 16th century, particularly in Europe, it was rather invasive, uncouth, just not practiced to open people up after they died, right? This is this idea that the body is very sacred, right? The soul is housed within it, right? And there is very much a church doctrinal notion of what you're able to do and not do. Well, this basically gets changed by an individual by the name of Vasilian. And he comes up with this anatomical encyclopedia where basically every single part of the body is named, identified, and discussed in terms of its purpose and its function in relation to other parts of the body. Fundamentally and radically changes the way in which the human body and medicine and health are thought about in Western Europe. Now, what are they building this from? Well, of course, they're building this from other individuals, namely achievements that are going on that had already happened in Asia as well as in the Middle East. Okay, so this is once again another building upon these ideas. And so when you want to think about these notions is that we didn't necessarily have to just rely on theory or rely on animal text, right? Now we can actually see. And where this is really stemming from is from the rise in universities, right? Is that many universities, especially in Europe, particularly in Europe, excuse me, as well as in the Middle East, were centered around religious institutions. Okay, so many, like if you look at Oxford and Cambridge, that founded as religious centers. If you look at any of the major universities, like in Paris, for instance, or in Germany, many of these are tied to to religious institutions. And so while the religious institution is still very much plays a part, especially as the first universities developed in the 12th century, by the time we get to the 16th century, the role that the church is playing, it's not that it's no longer present, it's just not deemed as being the prime authority. Okay. What is becoming the prime authority is what we would um, characterize as being what a true university is, right? Prior to the 16th century, most universities were both those spiritual centers of learning as well as the type of information that was being disseminated to students, right? That much of this is being taught in terms of mathematics. We're looking at church doctrine. We're looking at theological studies, right? Aspects like this, you know. But then what starts to happen is that there is more of a shift in terms of the secular knowledge that's important, right? The teachings of, deeper aspects of mathematical learning. We're looking at philosophy, looking at the aspects in terms of, various ideologies, and now questioning those, previous church doctrines, because now what we're having is more secularized instructors, right? What you would call faculty, right? And so these aspects in terms of, universities themselves is that, all the things that we associate with the university. You've got an established faculty, you've got courses of studies, you get a degree, right? And of course, there's ceremonies and graduations. Interestingly enough, if you guys, ever look at the robes, you've got like bachelor's, master's, and PhDs, is that each of the robes are different because each of the robes are meant to be at a certain length, above or below the knee. They have various types of sleeves that indicate the status of the individual, and then the robe itself has various other status marks and symbols to be able to confer degree. So for instance, the hood that is traditionally put on somebody for a PhD, back in the day, it was an actual hood. It was meant to, cover and keep you warm and such. Well, the traditional, hood, like when I received my hood, it's based on various colors. So my PhD, which is in philosophy, so mine is like a dark blue, and I still have the hood and I still have my robes just in case if I ever have to, go to some sort of faculty ceremony. But I will admit to you that yes, the robe is extremely heavy. But it also has other markings like the chevrons, it's these little black bars that are on the gown itself. It is very heavy. When I graduated in the springtime, thank goodness it was indoors because I probably would have, probably fainted had I worn that outside. Because it is something that is very, very it's good for the winter. Will keep you warm, but in the summertime, It's the most uncomfortable thing in the world, especially when I was taking pictures outside with the family. I was like, okay, we've got a couple of these, and then we got to gotta take this thing off. Okay, so really, what you want to think about with the rise of universities is moving away from church clergy as the authorities to more secular faculty as the guidance of authority, right? Secular knowledge, the ability in which to question, right? No longer is it going to seen as heresy if somebody questions church doctrine. It's now going to be like, well, we have an empirical method, we have a scientific methodology, we're able to arrive at a form of truth if we do these processes, right? This is what comes in. And so this is really what the key is, okay, for this entire experience of the scientific revolution, is that it is a shift in the authority of knowledge, right? Who holds the keys to be able to say, you know what, that's true, that's not, right? What we see during this event is that if we start with Luther, Luther comes up with this notion that an individual can claim a relationship with God, right? Without the church as an intermediary, right? What does that impact? Well, it asserts both individuality and independence, as well as choice. And the highest form of freedom, according to, if you guys read any philosophy, if you read, Kant, Kant argues that the highest form of freedom is choice, right? The ability in which to exercise a decision. And this is what it is that Luther was doing. He's allowing and opening this a possibility that people can exercise a decision without having it to be confirmed by church leadership. So if we build off of that idea, that if people are taking that notion that, look, I don't have to have it confirmed by somebody, I can confirm it through a methodology to see if I'm actually right. And so what this does is that this opens up the opportunity for more and more people to question that authority that was deeming things to be true or untrue to now question and find out for themselves. Okay. So that's very, very crucial, is that we are shifting this authority in terms of who holds the knowledge, who holds the information, that it's no longer just one group or one organization. Now we have several opportunities to do this, both individually and collectively. So the second aspect is that you have the rise in the universities, right? The dissemination of knowledge. It's no longer monopolized. And so what happens is that learning becomes centered on methodology, proofs, moves away from spiritual, faith-based conjecture, and we have the ability in which to discover for ourselves. Crucially, though, remember, don't forget the technological invention of the printing press before Luther, 50 years before Luther, by Gutenberg, that opens up the ability for people to access information, right? So if you have a combination of a technological revolutions, right, in terms of tools that are allowing people to use and to enhance their knowledge or their ideas that they want to be able to discover, this is no longer going to be created in a vacuum, because once somebody discovers something, guess what? They can just have it printed and then they can send it off and other people can just build upon it, right? That is what is so crucial about this period, is that freedom is now becoming far more available for people to be able to engage in these ideas. And this is what's going to be able to allow it's going to allow us these other major changes that are going to be happening in the late 16th century and into in the 17th century and into the 18th century. And so what we're going to be looking at is that you have a scientific method, processes of developing empirical evidence, right? You no longer have to approach problems with, an authority from the church. You can simply discover it yourself. We have the tools and the ability in which to test it. We have inventions that are going to allow us to access and be able to look even further or deeper. We have information that is available. And once we are coming up with these theories and these ideas, guess what? We can be able to, you know, we can be able to record that information, and we can be able to share and disseminate it out, which creates more learning, more engagement, more questionings, and it just begins to further itself, right? But because the control of this information is no longer in the hands of one group, it's now disseminated. This is where the authority begins to shift, right? from a faith-based to a secular, from religious institutions to universities, from, the powerful to the common people. Okay. Freedom is now becoming more expansive because people are able to access this and are be able to participate in it without a permission of an authority. Okay. So if you have any questions on that, feel free to, reach out and we can discuss it.